It's June 8, 1985. The Olive Tan Scout Group is preparing to make the trek up Pico dos Marins, the second highest peak in the state of Sao Paulo. Many people have been left wondering what exactly occurred that day, but what is certain is that whatever happened, it has haunted the local community for nearly 40 years. This is the story of the disappearance of 15-year-old Marco Aurélio Simon. Marco Aurelio and his twin brother Marco Antonio were born January 16, 1970, in the state of Sao Paulo to Mr. Ivo Simon and Mrs. Teresa Noima. They were a very tight-knit family consisting of 5 children: Adriana, Fabio, Marco Antonio, Marco Aurelio, and the youngest, Patricia. Marco Aurelio was, by all accounts, a very spirited youth. Marco Aurelio would have a transformative encounter with scouting, when one day as an early teenager, a local scout group would ask permission to camp on their property for the night. After granting permission, Marco would become fascinated with the scouts and even join their activities, going as far as to sleep in the tents with them. After moving homes to Greater Sao Paulo, it didn't take long before both brothers joined the local scouts, the Olive Tan Scout Group. Marco Aurelio was an enthusiastic scout. Upon hitting 15 years of age, he was set to become a senior scout, and the chief of the Olive Tan Scouts, Juan, had an idea of scaling up a mountain as a sort of rite of passage for the new rank. Finally, Juan would settle on a mountain for the trip, the Pico dos Marins. The twin brothers and their father Ivo were looking forward to this excursion. Unfortunately, Marco Antonio would fall ill, and so would not be able to join. Naturally, their father Ivo decided he would stay back to care for Marco Antonio. The final scout roster for this trip would consist of 4 scouts. And of course, they would be accompanied by their leader, Juan. The scout group would reach the start of the trail on June 6, 1985. This area was the home of a local named Alfonso. The scout leader Juan would ask Alfonso for his permission to set up camp in his backyard for the night, to which Alfonso agreed. They would set up their tents and rest here for the night. The next morning, when the scouts exited their tents, a peculiar sight awaited them. All of their belongings had been tossed around, seemingly rummaged through. Juan would ask Alfonso if he had seen what caused it, and Alfonso would state he didn't see anything, but that it was likely a wild dog. They would spend the day performing various activities and preparing for the next day, the day they would actually make the climb. That night would prove to be another strange one. The boys would hear footsteps outside their tents, human footsteps. And the boys would remain quiet to simply listen and observe. And at one point, this person outside their tent would actually pass their hand along their tent, and the scouts would remain observant until after some time of silence, fatigue overtook them, and they simply fell asleep. The next morning, the boys would consult with their leader Juan about what happened to them. Juan would speak to Alfonso and ask him if he had any idea what made that sound, if he was the one who was walking around their campsite that night. And Alfonso would deny this, and at this point the group would actually learn that Alfonso has a son who supposedly has a mental disorder. Alfonso suggests the possibility that his son accidentally scared the boys. Seemingly accepting this explanation, and undeterred from their greater goal, they begin preparations for the climb. At around 7 a.m., 3 scouts from a local group pass by the Olive Tan Scouts campsite, and they have the same goal of scaling up the peak, and so they would ask the Olive Tan Scouts if they would like to join them. And reportedly, these scouts are more familiar with the area, and after all, there's greater safety in numbers. However, leader Juan would decline the offer, and a little bit later, they would begin their journey. Their ascent would not start off particularly well, even though Juan had consulted with Alfonso the night before on the best route to take. Juan would end up missing a turn. Upon realizing this, the group had already gone far enough that Juan decided it best to simply continue on their path. While going along the path, the scouts would encounter a tent, and the scouts would make their presence known, asking if there was anyone in the tent or if they needed help, but they were met with silence, and so they pressed on. It's 2 p.m. The Olive Tan Scouts have made it to the 2,060-meter elevation mark. While making their way through the rough terrain, disaster would strike. While walking over some small boulders, Scout Osvaldo would slip and his foot would slide into a gap between these rocks, and he would smash his knee onto the stones. Osvaldo, in serious pain, needed some time to gather himself and see if he could walk on his own. After some time passed, Osvaldo still could not stand on his own, with shooting pain going through his leg whenever he tried. At this point, his knee had significant swelling, and he felt as though it had been dislocated. And it is at this point that leader Juan makes the call to cancel the rest of the ascent and turn back and descend the mountain. Being resourceful, the scouts scavenged some branches to build a stretcher, but unfortunately the branches weren't the best quality and they snapped whenever they tried to support Osvaldo. Juan and Ricardo resorted to carrying Osvaldo themselves, and so they begin their slow descent down the mountain. But after traversing around 250 meters, they realize there's a problem. It's just too slow. They know that once the sun begins to set, it'll start getting really cold at this high of an altitude. Since the scouts planned on a simple ascent to the top and then back to the bottom in the same day, they had packed limited supplies suitable for a quick journey. Recognizing they were in a serious bind, Marco stated that he wanted to go ahead of the group and make the descent himself. This way he could get help faster. Osvaldo and the other boys vehemently disagree with this. It is a general safety rule within scouting and many other professions that no matter what, the group never separates. However, Chief Scout Juan agrees to let Marco make the trek down alone. Juan would walk with Marco some distance away from the group in order to point him to the correct path to take. Juan would also instruct Marco to leave a trail on his way down, specifically to use chalk to write the number 240 on any rocks that he passed. And so Marco began his journey all the way down. Around 15 minutes later, the rest of the group would begin their slow trek after Marco. On their way back, they would pass by 3 stones marked with the number 240. Finally, they would reach a fork in the path. The left path requires you to pass between 2 large stones, and one of these stones was marked 240. Despite this, Juan would state that they should go right. He reasoned that the terrain on the left path was too rough to carry Osvaldo through. The boys would protest this decision, but they would eventually relent as Juan would tell them he was confident that both paths eventually meet. And with that, the scouts took the path on the right. After navigating the path for some time, the group would realize that the path on the right is not actually going to meet the path Marco took. And at this point, they've been navigating a long series of downhill slopes. To try to go back now would be very difficult, especially with Osvaldo in his current state. They had to press on, and they would keep walking well into the night, where temperature dropped to sub-zero. Their uniform consisted only of a t-shirt and shorts, but they had to push through. Osvaldo's accident occurred at around 2 p.m., and they would make it back to their campsite at 5 a.m. the next day. From the start of the ascent to them reaching the base camp again was roughly 20 hours worth of hiking. It's been reported that the local scout group that passed through the Olive Tent Scouts base camp earlier the day before, the ones who had offered a joint group journey, completed their hike and returned to base camp at around 3 p.m., taking them less than half the time it took the Olive Tent Scouts. When the Olive Tent Scouts arrived at the tents, they expected to see Marco there, but he was nowhere to be found. There was one thing that caught their attention though: Marco's backpack. It was sitting outside the tent, open. Had Marco made it back? Where did he go? Juan would instruct the scouts to eat and get some deep rest. He himself would sleep, but only for an hour. He woke up at around 6 a.m., where he informed the scouts he would go search for Marco himself. He'd return at base camp at around 10 a.m. alone. At this moment, their minibus driver, Paulinho, had arrived at their base camp, and he was waiting to take the Olive Tent Scouts home. But at this time, he would be informed that they had a missing person. Paulinho would inform the boss of the Piquet Scouts of the situation and ask for assistance. 4 volunteer scouts from the Piquet Scouts arrived later to assist in searching for Marco. The 2 scout groups would spend the entire day searching for Marco, but he was still nowhere to be found. As the night began to take over, a heavy rainfall would follow. The search party knew they had to call off the search for the night. The search party returned to Afonso's house, where he and his wife had prepared a meal for everyone. Their time of recuperation would be short-lived. At around 8 p.m., while sharing their meal, they would hear a sound coming from the woods outside. A scream. Immediately, everyone froze and looked at each other. Did you hear that? They must have thought maybe it was a wild animal, or maybe we're all just tired. These thoughts were immediately interrupted by another scream, but this time it was followed by a familiar sound. The sound of a scout whistle. Everyone immediately exited the house, but when they looked at where the sound came from, they were dumbfounded by what they saw. In the middle of the woods, a bright blue light. The group can only stare as the light blinks 3 times and then fades away to nothing. The group begins to press forward into the woods where the light and screams came from, shouting for Marco the entire time. But the woods remain silent. Marco is still missing. That night, all of the scouts leave the mountain, and the Olive Tent Scouts stay in one of the local Piquet Scouts' residences. The local police are notified, and Juan calls Marco's father Ivo to inform him of Marco's disappearance. The police arrange a search party and a local guide, and the chief scout Juan would remain in Piquet to assist them with any questions they had, while the young scouts were told to return to Sao Paulo. At this time, Marco Aurelio's parents arrive in Piquet to assist with the searches. The police advised the parents that since they had little experience in the mountains, it would probably not be a good idea for them to join and may even hinder the search effort. and reluctantly the parents agree. On the first day of official searching, they would still find no hint of Marco Aurelio. Even though they agreed to not join the search, Marco Aurelio's parents were not ones to sit idle while their son is missing. The parents put together a sort of task force of their own to spread the word of their son's disappearance. You see, Mr. Evo used to be a journalist, and over the many years of his career, he built a rapport with many media outlets. And as a result, Marco Aurelio's image and story would be soon shared across televisions all over Brazil. The second day of searches starts slow, but eventually a set of footprints are discovered, leading into an area known as the Iron Cross, an area that is part of an old trail that had been closed due to being too dangerous. They follow the trail, but the footprints eventually disappear without a trace. Suspiciously, later that day, a fire would break out on the mountain. The local firefighters would be called in to come battle the flames, but unfortunately, those firefighters were currently part of the search party, and so they would have to be pulled away from the search to go fight the fire. It is also on this day that the COE arrives to assist. The COE are a type of special forces branch of the police, and their arrival is due to Evo's efforts reaching out to his contacts. The next several days of searches intensified, and so did the media attention, especially due to the arrival of the COE, and later a battalion from the Brazilian army. Still, after all of this, no Marco. The searches would take place over 28 days, and it's reported that this involved 180 army soldiers, 18 members of the COE, 2 planes, 2 helicopters, 10 dogs, firefighters, local guides, climbers, and even psychics. At its height, it had nearly 300 people searching. After 28 days of not having found the missing scout, the COE pulled out of the search, stating they had done everything possible. This would be the death knell for the searches, and it wasn't long after that the searches were officially closed. A month of searching, one of the largest searches in the country's history, and not a trace of Marco Aurelio was found. As it is with all cases that reach high levels of media attention, there was a lot of pressure to solve it, and many theories have been put forward over the years, especially considering the lack of evidence. This leaves the door wide open to speculation. As is typical when someone goes missing in the wilderness, it only makes sense to assume that the person succumbed to some facet of the elements. It's possible that he died of hypothermia, assuming he got lost. After all, the scouts were only dressed in their standard uniform, and it easily reached sub-zero temperatures that night. Was he killed by an animal attack, or maybe a big cat or snake or something? The problem with most of these natural explanations is that it would be some trace of Marco Aurelio to be found. The most likely of natural explanations would be that he fell into a deep crevice. You see, Pico dos Marins has these sort of cracks throughout the area, where if you fell in, you wouldn't be able to get out on your own. Several local cave explorers were part of the search, and they did explore many of these crevices and found nothing. The search was very thorough. They even watched the sky to see if vultures were circling particular areas. They did actually see this, but when they investigated the area, all they found was a dead ox. It does raise the question though, could it be that he fell into one so deep that not even the vultures would know? Almost immediately, blame was directed at the chief scout Juan. How could he be so careless? But many people, after hearing the details of the case, immediately wondered, did Juan kill Marco Aurelio? Honestly, anyone analyzing the events leading up to the disappearance would naturally be suspicious of him. How is it that he made so many incorrect decisions? And many would think that it had to be intentional, and this was even the opinion of some of the police investigators. When Juan walked Marco Aurelio to point him to the path to take, they walked far enough that they could no longer be seen. Proponents of this murder theory put forth that this was when Juan killed the boy, and then roughly hid his body on the left trail of the fork, and so this would be the real reason for why Juan took the path on the right, instead of following the path that Marco Aurelio supposedly took. When the scouts were making their way back to base camp and stopped at a local farm, Juan only asked directions for Afonso's house, back to their base camp. At no point did he ask if this farmer had seen Marco Aurelio or if he's noticed anything of interest. And then, of course, when the scouts finally arrived back at the camp, Juan went by himself to go search for Marco Aurelio, when he could have asked Afonso to assist him. And then, of course, he returns 5 hours later, empty-handed. So this would be when he fully disposed of the body, according to this theory. When you investigate deeper, there are some good reasons to think this. Obviously, on the surface, the first thing that jumps to mind is, why would you let Marco Aurelio go alone? It really is a basic rule not to split up. And even if you did, why not at least pair him up with someone else? It also gets worse when you consider the fact that Marco Aurelio was actually visually impaired. Marco Aurelio and his twin brother Marco Antonio were born prematurely after 6 months of pregnancy and remained in an incubator for the next 3. Thankfully, they both survived, but it left the boys with certain medical conditions. For Marco Aurelio, this meant he had an eye condition which left him with effectively 45% of his vision capabilities. It's worth noting that this condition never stopped him as a child. He played outside, he rode bikes, all the things that an energetic kid would want to do. And I would expect that someone like Marco Aurelio would absolutely want to push ahead and do everything that he could to help his fellow scouts. But why, as the chief scout, the only adult here, would you let a visually impaired kid separate from the group and make his own way down the mountain? Investigators would question how the scout group got so lost and why it took so many hours to hike a fairly well-known, well-traveled area, where the commonly taken trail would only take a few hours, especially considering Juan had traversed the trail about a year prior. As mentioned, before the scouts departed base camp, a group from the local Piquech scouts suggested they hike together, which Juan declined. But even prior to arriving to Pico dos Marins, when Juan had first selected the mountain as the trail for the excursion, there was a board meeting at the Olive Tan Scout Group HQ, wherein it was decided that Afonso would join and lead the group along the trail. He does have around 30 years of experience in the area after all. However, Juan dismissed his help that day and later stated that Afonso was too busy and didn't have time. Afonso himself would deny this and say that actually he was available and even he and his wife had prepared snacks for the scouts. Investigators would also interview people who worked with Juan and would record statements describing him as someone who did not comply with the rules of scouting, was authoritarian, threatened the boys, and did not admit to being reprimanded. And others have described him as someone who is cold and having strange behavior, with conduct that was abnormal of a healthy person. With all of this information, it's unsurprising that Juan had been previously expelled from another scout group. Of course, to say Juan killed Marco Aurelio would mean you also have to establish motive. And while under interrogation, the scout Osvaldo would say that the night before the climb, he woke up in the middle of the night to see Marco Aurelio and Juan leaving the tent together, with the implication here being a sort of sex crime. And so the reasoning of this theory is that after abusing Marco Aurelio, Juan had to find some way of making sure the scout wouldn't talk. However, a journalist would uncover that during the police investigation, Juan and some of the scouts themselves were subjected to physical and psychological torture and manipulation. This would obviously render basically all testimonies unreliable. And a year after making that statement, Osvaldo would actually confess that he lied about Juan and Marco Aurelio leaving the tent together. So the truth is a little unclear. Other than the one false testimony of Osvaldo, all of the scouts would defend Juan, even through the reported abuse they endured at the hands of the interrogators. Juan himself was subjected to the worst of it. He even reportedly underwent a hypnosis session in addition to a polygraph test. He maintained his innocence throughout all of it. Juan was actually quite close to the Simon family and would occasionally spend holidays with them. In fact, Marco Aurelio's father Ivo would comment on these theories and state, "Only those who did not know Juan would think of such atrocities." Perhaps the strangest theory is that Marco Aurelio was abducted by aliens. Proponents of this theory point to the night of the blue light phenomena, stating that this was when he was abducted. The Picos dos Marins is said to have a large amount of magnetic energy. In ufology and New Age spiritualism, areas with these high concentration of magnetic energy are said to be considered where aliens or advanced beings are attracted to or even live. Some say there are also portals to other worlds or dimensions. Interestingly, the trail that leads through the narrow rocks that Marco Aurelio would have had to pass through is nicknamed the portal, and some local legends state that passing through this is to enter into a different world or dimension. Now, obviously, I am sort of conflating these two different aspects. Not everyone who believes in aliens believes in portals and other worlds or New Age spiritualism, etc. Brazil is no stranger to UFO sightings and encounters. And I'd say it's one of the countries with the most UFO sightings. And so a significant amount of locals, even Marco Aurelio's parents themselves, have not ruled this out as a possibility. Other theories explore the possibility that Marco Aurelio was kidnapped. It's important to note that even though Marco Aurelio was visually impaired, he was still a trained scout, and at the time of his disappearance, it was clear, sunny skies, and again, the Pico dos Marins is frequently traveled. Maybe it's not so outlandish that Marco Aurelio made it down the mountain searching for help and found someone. But unfortunately, the person he would encounter had ill intentions. To explore this further, while the Piquech scouts were making the climb, one of the scouts pressed further ahead than the rest of his group and was going through the trail alone, while along the way, He was frightened by the sudden appearance of a man dressed in all brown walking the trail and coming towards him. The men simply smiled though, greeted him, and continued past the boy. When the rest of the scout group caught up to the lone scout, he would ask them if they had crossed paths with the man that he just saw. They had no idea what he was talking about. And if you remember, the all 10 scouts passed by a seemingly abandoned tent far along the trail with no sign of whoever it belonged to. When the Pikesh scouts made their journey up and down the trail, both ways they noticed a pickup truck parked in a clearing, and next to this pickup truck was an empty tent. The descriptions of the tent that the Pikesh scouts saw and the Olive 10 scouts encountered seem to match, but it's unclear if they are actually the same one. Some have theorized that the man in brown kidnapped Marco Aurelio and that the tent and truck belonged to him. This is obviously a very loose set of circumstances, and the general public hike the mountain often, so just because someone was there the same day doesn't mean they had something to do with the disappearance of Marco Aurelio. Some others have theorized that a Christian sect living in the mountains may have actually been the kidnappers. The Blue Butterfly sect is a small Catholic sect who, at some point in their history, had a turning point, wherein they became a sort of doomsday sect, preaching that a flood would occur on May 13th, 1980. They would walk through the streets of their town dressed in blue and white robes, which is how they got their name, warning people of the impending doom. Many rumors about this group being a depraved cult would spread. It seems that most people at this time didn't like them or paid them as little mind as possible. After the fateful day came and went without so much as rain, most of the group disbanded, and some members would relocate to other towns. From here, more rumors about them would be spread, with some of them stating that they are actually child kidnappers and killers. There indeed was a small branch of these blue butterflies in the area, and they would be spoken to regarding Marco Aurelio's disappearance, but they denied seeing or hearing anything, and nothing really came of it. One day, Marco Aurelio's father received an anonymous call from someone stating that they had kidnapped Marco Aurelio. The police had actually previously worked with the father to set up phone taps in case of such an event. The kidnapper was asking for a large ransom and told the parents when and where to make the drop, instructing that Marco Aurelio's mother would actually be the one to make the handoff. Unfortunately, the police were unable to actually locate the caller using the phone tap, so they had no choice but to proceed with the money drop. On the day of, a female officer disguised as the mother sat on a bench in the designated location and waited for the kidnappers. Officers were observing and lying in wait in nearby buildings. However, no one ever came. It was reported that the police noticed the same car had passed the area at least 3 times, but for whatever reason, the police did not stop the vehicle, nor did they even bother writing the license plate down. It's possible that the supposed kidnappers sensed something was wrong, or, realized that the person waiting for them didn't actually look like Marco Aurelio's mother, and fled. As far as I'm aware, the family never heard of these kidnappers again. This brings us to our last set of theories, which suppose that Marco Aurelio is actually still alive. During the searches for Marco Aurelio, the family tried everything they could think of. The family had an opportunity to speak with Chico Xavier, one of the most famous spiritual mediums in Brazil. Chico was known for supposedly being able to communicate with the spirits of the dead. When he was asked if he could contact Marco Aurelio, he stated, "I could not communicate with Marco Aurelio because I only communicate with the dead and not with the living." Chico was not the only medium or psychic consulted, and many of them would claim that Marco Aurelio was still alive. The lack of evidence or any clear suspect would naturally lead many to conclude that Marco Aurelio simply used this opportunity to run away from home. It's been reported that on April 13th, 1986, a bus driver would have a peculiar encounter with a young boy that prompted him to contact police. A bus driver was on his normal route when, at a stop, a young boy claiming to be a scout stated that his scout group had gone ahead without him, but unfortunately he didn't have any money to pay the driver, so he was just asking for a free trip. The driver agreed and the boy got on. And when the bus finally arrived at the last stop, the boy simply got off, and that was that. Feeling a little weirded out by the situation and having heard about a missing scout, the bus driver called the police to report this encounter. The police asked him to come down to the station so they could get his statement. As he was telling the story, unbeknownst to him, the police had also invited Marco Aurelio's family so that they could actually listen to his testimony. After listening to this compelling story, the police asked twin brother Marco Antonio to come into the room. And as soon as he did, the bus driver jumped up and shouted, The police and family would find this very compelling, but unfortunately there was not much more detail for them to go off of. At the end of the day, they just knew that a boy claiming to be a scout got off a bus in that city, and any other related leads quickly led to a dead end. There were many other accounts of people claiming to have seen Marco Aurelio, but nothing really came of them. On April 16, 1990, nearly 5 years after his disappearance, the official investigation was closed with no real conclusion, but heavily implying that Marco Aurelio must have simply ran away from home. But given that much was known about his personal life, it seems highly unlikely, as by all accounts he was very happy and had found real purpose in being a scout. He had strong bonds with his scout friends, and it wouldn't really make sense for him to abandon Osvaldo and the others in their time of need. In order to try and make sense of this, some have proposed that perhaps he suffered some kind of head injury on his way down and maybe forgot who he was, and so he still made it down the mountain and one way or another ended up living as a different person, maybe even having been adopted and perhaps currently living in a different town. On July 29, 2021, the case was reopened, now 36 years later, with a new lead. An audio clip had been circulating local WhatsApp groups that would leave people very startled. The clip alleged to be a recording of Alfonso's daughter Marley while she was on her hospital bed days before she died from COVID complications earlier the same month. In it, she would state that her brother was responsible for killing Marco Aurelio. She said that when Marco Aurelio made it back to the base camp seeking help, he would have startled him, which would have led him to mistakenly killing Marco Aurelio. Further, she would say that their father Alfonso would cover up for his son by burying Marco Aurelio's body underneath his own bed. This led to police performing an excavation in the small home. Using metal detectors and georadar, they would perform a thorough dig. What they found was a single small bone. Anxiously, they would send it off to get tested. It wouldn't be long before the results came back. A chicken bone. While this specific version of events was therefore ruled out by police, the possibility that the brother was the killer was not fully dismissed. As previously mentioned, Alfonso's son was reported to be mentally ill, to the point that Alfonso actually built a small house next to the main home wherein he would lock his son. The son was known to disappear into the mountains for 3 to 4 days at a time and then come back home. To investigators, this would indicate that he had knowledge of the area, and so he'd potentially be able to hide a body. I also want to take this opportunity to mention that all of this could simply be bias against those who are mentally ill, and it's also not clear what kind of illness or disability he even had in the first place. On July 4th, 1989, 4 years after Marco Aurelio's disappearance, we find out that Alfonso's son was having an argument with his mother. She was trying to give him his medication, and he was refusing. After being forced to take it, he stormed off into the woods, which again was very typical of him to do, but this time he never came back. His family did not have many means to make a big media splash, and we still do not know what happened to him. A second set of excavations would occur on November 16, 2022, where investigators identified 2 possible areas of the Pico dos Marins where excavation was warranted. A team of 20 people, including sniffer dogs, were present. After hours of excavation, they would only find small biological material like hair, which after analysis did not belong to Marco Aurelio. Last year, on September 18, 2023, another series of excavations took place, but this time they were more targeted. See, enough time has passed since Marco Aurelio's disappearance that we've actually seen large advances in technology. Investigators used drones equipped with high-resolution instruments to scan the relevant Pico dos Marins area, and with the use of AI, we're able to detect 5 areas containing foreign material. Over the span of 5 days, these sites would be painstakingly excavated, with dozens of samples being collected for analysis. The last report I found of this was in November of 2023, and I can't seem to find anything stating if analysis was complete or what the results were. Though, of course, if there is silence, then maybe the results were inconclusive. So what does the family think happened to Marco Aurelio? The family have maintained, actually, that Marco Aurelio must still be alive. And this is simply due to the fact that there is no concrete evidence to support his death. Given this, over the years, the family has put in giant efforts in pursuing the possibility that Marco Aurelio is still alive. The family have put together press releases with photos containing approximations of what an older Marco Aurelio may look like. Some use photos of his twin brother, but they've also released photos showing what he may look like if he was a wanderer as well. The family has consistently tried to keep a strong media presence. They've been in touch with many television channels, YouTube channels, podcasts, and they've even aided in putting together whole documentaries. They operate dedicated social media accounts on Twitter, YouTube, and even run a blog. They haven't lost hope that he is still alive and are doing everything they can to find him. Researching this case was a bit difficult for a few reasons. It's a story spanning nearly 40 years, and so even reliable sources don't have all the information that we know today. So things have had to be manually pieced together. Not all the sources I could find even agreed with each other on certain details, but I've done my best to provide what seems to be the most correct information. And naturally, nearly all of this information is in Brazilian Portuguese, which is a language I don't speak, and so I've been relying on computer translations, which, aren't always reliable. And because of this language barrier, it actually has made it hard to even get access to certain resources. So, for example, Rodrigo Nunez is an investigative journalist who wrote 3 books over the years on this case, and he conducted interviews, his own investigation, and compiled all of these results in these books. And what I've realized from researching this case is that many of these key details that I'm reading from these sources are actually being pulled from. They're citing these books. And so it's been a really big challenge to try to actually access these books, as they don't seem to be for sale anymore. Ultimately, it's been quite a challenge to narrow down what to include or exclude in this video. I've tried to make it as accurate as possible based on everything that I've read. But of course, if you have more information or if you know that something is accurate or inaccurate in what I've said, then please, leave a comment below and let me know, and I'll make sure to address that. At the end of the day, I can only hope that I've done right by the family, as I wish to be respectful with this sensitive topic. Reading about this is one thing, but after watching so many of the interviews with the family and seeing their pain, it really put things into perspective. And frankly, it's kind of hard not to share their optimism that Marco Aurelio is still alive. They've been so strong for so many years.
O pai, jornalista, espalhou cartazes por todo o Brasil. Recebeu telefonemas anônimos, pedidos de...
Já esgotamos os nossos recursos, todos na procura do menino. E são 3 anos, e 3 anos agora cada vez é mais difícil.
Thanks for watching. If you have any information regarding the whereabouts of Marco Aurelio, though I know that that may be a slim chance given that this is quite a local issue, but if you do, then please don't hesitate to contact the family. I will leave the contact links in the description below. Thank you.